You've chosen to spend 2 hours exploring the lore of Ghost of Tsushima to sleep to, and you made the perfect choice for drifting into peaceful rest tonight. As you settle in and let the day fade away, we're going to journey through the tragic beauty of Tsushima Island during one of Japan's darkest hours, where honor collided with survival, and a single samurai became a legend by abandoning everything he was taught to believe. This is a complete story of Jin Sakai's transformation and the Mongol invasion, told gently to guide you towards sleep. The year was 1274, and the island of Tsushima existed as a small piece of paradise between the mainland of Japan and the Korean peninsula. The island was not large, perhaps 50 miles across at its widest point, but within that modest space existed a world of stunning natural beauty. Rolling hills covered in golden grass swayed in ocean breezes that carried the scent of salt and pine. Ancient forests of maple and bamboo created shaded paths where sunlight filtered through leaves in dancing patterns. Hot springs bubbled from volcanic rock, their waters heated by the earth itself and treasured by those who knew where to find them. Rice fields stretched across valleys in geometric patterns, carefully maintained by farmers whose families had worked the same land for generations. The coastline alternated between gentle beaches of white sand and dramatic cliffs, where waves crashed against black volcanic stone, sending spray high into the air. This island was home to approximately 30,000 people, most of them farmers and fishermen, who lived simple lives governed by the changing seasons. They planted rice in spring, tended their crops through summer, harvested in autumn, and prepared for harsh winters when snow blanketed the northern peaks. Their villages were small collections of wooden homes with thatched roofs, built close together for warmth and protection. Life was hard but predictable, and the people found contentment in the rhythms of agricultural work and the bonds of community. Above these common people in the strict social hierarchy of feudal Japan stood the samurai, warriors who had pledged their lives to protect the island and serve their lord. These men were not numerous, perhaps a few hundred at most, but their presence shaped every aspect of island life. The samurai followed a code called Bushido, the way of the warrior, which governed every action and decision. This code demanded absolute loyalty to one's lord, courage in the face of any danger, and adherence to honor above all else, even life itself. A samurai who acted dishonorably brought shame not just upon himself, but upon his entire family line, a stain that could never be fully erased. The code of Bushido taught that there was only one proper way to fight. A samurai announced himself to his opponent, declaring his name and lineage, so that both warriors knew whom they faced. Combat was direct and honest, sword against sword, with victory going to a more skilled fighter. Using tricks or deception was considered cowardly and dishonorable. Attacking an enemy from behind or using poison was beneath contempt. A samurai who could not defeat his enemy honorably was expected to accept defeat with dignity, meeting death with composure and grace. This approach to warfare was beautiful in its simplicity and nobility, but assumed that enemies would follow the same rules, sharing the same values and understanding of honor. The ruler of Tsushima was Lord Shimura, a man in his 60s who had spent his entire life in service to these ideals. He was the Jito, the military governor appointed by the Kamakura shogunate to administer the island and command its defenses. Lord Shimura was everything a samurai should be according to tradition. He was dignified and composed, speaking with measured words and moving with deliberate grace. He wore his authority naturally, commanding respect through presence rather than intimidation. His judgment was considered fair and his loyalty to the shogun absolute. He lived in Castle Shimura, a fortress that stood on high ground overlooking much of the southern portion of the island, its walls and towers a symbol of samurai power and protection. Lord Shimura had never married and had no children of his own, but he had raised his nephew Jin Sakai as his son and heir. Jin's father had been Shimura's younger brother, a samurai of great skill and honor, who had died when Jin was very young. The circumstances of his father's death had shaped Jin's entire life, though the full truth of what happened remained hidden for many years. Lord Shimura had taken the orphan boy into his household and raised him with strict discipline, teaching him everything a samurai needed to know. Jin learned to wield a katana with precision, to ride a horse with confidence, to compose poetry, to appreciate art, and above all, to value honor above his own life. Jin Sakai grew into a skilled warrior, but one who struggled with the weight of expectations placed upon him. He was talented with a sword, perhaps even gifted, but he had a tendency to question traditions rather than simply accepting them. This questioning nature concerned Lord Shimura, who saw it as a potential weakness. A samurai who hesitated or doubted might fail when decisiveness was required. Jin tried to suppress these doubts, wanting desperately to make his uncle proud and to honor his father's memory. He wore the armor and colors of Clan Sakai, bearing the family name with all the responsibility that entailed. He was in his mid-30s by the time the Mongols arrived, old enough to have experience, but young enough to still be proving himself worthy of his lineage. The island samurai were organized into several clans, each with its own territories and responsibilities. Clan Shimura held the most power as the ruling family, but Clan Adachi controlled the northern regions, and several smaller clans managed various territories across the island. These clans cooperated under Lord Shimura's leadership, but maintained their own identities and traditions. The relationships between clans involved complex protocols of respect and obligation, with honor dictating proper behavior in every interaction. A slight against one's honor, even unintentional, could create conflicts that lasted for generations. The common people of Tsushima lived largely separate from samurai politics, focused on survival and family. They worked the land or the sea, paying taxes to their samurai lords in exchange for protection from bandits and other threats. Most peasants never spoke directly to a samurai, and when they did, they were expected to show extreme deference, bowing deeply and speaking only when addressed. The social distance between classes was vast, with samurai viewing themselves as fundamentally different from and superior to common people. A samurai lived by the sword and died by the sword, while a peasant lived by his labor and died in his bed. These were considered different types of existence, each with its own purpose in the natural order. Women in the society occupied their own complex position. Samurai women were expected to embody grace and obedience, managing households and raising children while supporting their husband's honor. They received some training in combat, enough to defend their homes if necessary, but were not warriors in the same sense as men. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields and boats, their labor essential to family survival. The ideals of proper feminine behavior varied significantly by class, but all women lived within strict social expectations that limited their choices and voices. Life on Tsushima before the invasion was not perfect, but it was stable. People understood their places in the social order and found meaning within those boundaries. The seasons changed. Children were born, the old died, and life continued in patterns that had persisted for centuries. There were hardships, of course. Crops sometimes failed, disease struck communities, disputes arose that required resolution. But these were known problems with familiar solutions. The people of Tsushima in 1274 could not have imagined what was about to descend upon their island, bringing destruction beyond anything in their experience or their nightmares. Across the sea to the west, the Mongol Empire had been expanding for decades under a succession of brilliant and ruthless leaders. The Mongols had conquered vast territories stretching from Eastern Europe to China, creating the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They were master horsemen and archers, their tactics refined through constant warfare against diverse enemies. The Mongols did not fight according to anyone else's rules. They used whatever methods brought victory, employing psychological warfare, espionage, siege engines, and coordinated cavalry charges with devastating effectiveness. They had toppled kingdoms and empires that had stood for centuries, and by 1274, they had set their sights on Japan. The Mongol ruler Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, had sent diplomatic missions to Japan demanding submission and tribute. The Japanese leadership had rejected these demands with contempt, insulting the Mongol messengers and refusing to acknowledge Mongol authority. This defiance sealed Japan's fate. Kublai Khan began assembling an invasion force, gathering ships and warriors from across his empire. The Mongols themselves provided the core of elite cavalry, but the invasion force also included Korean soldiers conscripted from the recently conquered Korean peninsula, as well as Chinese troops and sailors. This diverse army numbered approximately 30,000 men, a massive force by the standards of the time. The invasion fleet sailed in November of 1274, hundreds of ships carrying soldiers, horses, supplies, and siege equipment. The Mongols had chosen Tsushima as their first target precisely because it was small and isolated. Conquering the island would provide a base for further operations and would demonstrate Japanese vulnerability. The fleet approached Tsushima from the west, and fishermen who saw the ships in the distance could not comprehend what they were seeing. The number of vessels was beyond anything in their experience. A floating city moving across the water with impossible purpose. The Mongols landed at Komoda Beach on the western shore of Tsushima, a stretch of sand backed by low dunes and scattered pine trees. It was not ideal terrain for defense, but Lord Shimura gathered every samurai on the island to meet the invaders. He had perhaps 80 samurai under his command, along with their retainers and conscripted peasant soldiers, bringing his total force to maybe 300 men. Against 30,000, these numbers should have discouraged any thought of direct confrontation. But the samurai code demanded that they face their enemies honorably. To retreat without engaging would be shameful. To hide and wait for reinforcement would be cowardly. The samurai way was to meet enemies on the battlefield, and that is what they would do. Lord Shimura positioned his forces on the beach, arranging them in traditional formation with samurai in the front ranks and conscripts behind. The warriors stood in neat lines, their armor gleaming in the autumn sun, their banners displaying clan symbols rippling in the ocean breeze. They presented an image of order and discipline, strength through structure. Jin Sakai stood among them, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. He had trained his entire life for battle, but training and reality were very different things. He steadied his breathing and gripped his katana, drawing strength from the presence of his uncle and the other samurai around him. The Mongol army emerged from their ships in organized chaos, thousands of warriors moving with practiced efficiency. They wore different armor than the samurai, leather and metal plates designed for mobility rather than elaborate protection of samurai suits. They carried different weapons as well, composite bows that could shoot arrows farther than Japanese bows, sort of different designs, and weapons the samurai had never seen before. The Mongols formed their own battle lines, but they showed no interest in the formal challenges and declarations that preceded samurai combat. They were here to conquer, not to participate in ceremonies. Lord Shimura rode forward from the samurai lines, accompanied by Jin and several other senior warriors. This was a traditional way to begin battle, with leaders meeting to exchange challenges and establish terms. Shimura expected the Mongol commander to meet him for this ritual, but the Mongols had no such intentions. As Shimura and his party rode toward the Mongol lines, calling out their challenge, the Mongol response was swift and brutal. Hundreds of arrows filled the air, blackening the sky as they arced toward the small group of samurai. The arrows fell like deadly rain, and the samurai had no time to react. Jin's horse was struck by multiple arrows and collapsed beneath him, throwing him to the sand. Around him, other samurai fell, their armor pierced by the powerful Mongol arrows. Lord Shimura's horse bolted, carrying him away from the immediate danger, but several of his companions were not so fortunate. Jin struggled to his feet, disoriented and terrified, trying to understand what had just happened. The Mongols had attacked without warning, without honor, without giving the samurai any chance to fight properly. This was not how war was supposed to be conducted. Before the samurai could recover from their shock, the main Mongol force attacked. They did not charge in neat lines like the samurai expected. Instead, they advanced in waves, different units moving at different speeds to create confusion. Mongol cavalry swept around the flanks of the samurai formation, their horses incredibly fast and their riders shooting arrows with impossible accuracy, while at full gallop. Infantry units pressed forward in the center, carrying large shields and advancing steadily despite arrows from the samurai archers. Behind these front lines came soldiers carrying strange tubes that exploded with terrible noise and smoke, weapons unlike anything the samurai had ever encountered. The samurai formation began to collapse almost immediately. The warriors were brave and skilled as individuals, but their tactics were designed for single combat and small skirmishes, not for large-scale coordinated battle against an enemy who fought so differently. The Mongols used teamwork and coordination, multiple soldiers working together to bring down individual samurai. When a samurai engaged one opponent, others would attack from the sides or behind. The samurai code called this cowardice, but it was devastatingly effective. One by one, the defenders fell, overwhelmed by numbers and unfamiliar tactics. Jin fought with desperate intensity, his training taking over even as conscious thought became impossible. He blocked strikes from multiple directions, cut down soldiers who came within reach of his blade, and tried to maintain awareness of his surroundings despite the chaos. Blood covered his armor, some his own from minor wounds, most from enemies he had killed. The sounds of battle were overwhelming. Screams of dying men mixing with the clash of metal, the thunder of explosions, and the strange war cries of the Mongol warriors. Time seemed to distort, minutes feeling like hours as exhaustion began to overtake adrenaline. The battle was already lost, though many samurai refused to accept this reality. They fought on because the code demanded it, because surrender was unthinkable, because death in battle was preferable to the shame of defeat. Lord Shimura was somewhere in the chaos, still fighting, still trying to rally his men. Jin lost sight of his uncle as the press of enemies forced him backward toward the dunes. He was separated from the other samurai now, alone in a crowd of enemies, knowing that death was moments away. Then the explosion came. A Mongol weapon, one of the tubes that created such terrible noise, detonated near Jin with devastating force. The blast lifted him off his feet and threw him several yards through the air. He landed hard, his armor absorbing some of the impact, but not all of it. Pain radiated through his body, and his vision blurred as consciousness began to slip away. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the sky above, still blue and peaceful despite the hell that had erupted beneath it. The sounds of battle faded to a distant murmur, then to nothing at all. Jin did not die on that beach, though he should have. When the battle ended, the Mongols moved through the fallen, finishing off wounded samurai and stripping bodies of valuables. They should have found Jin and killed him, but somehow they overlooked him. Perhaps he was buried under other bodies, or perhaps the gathering darkness made him difficult to see. For whatever reason, he survived those first critical hours after battle. As night fell over Komoda Beach, the Mongols began establishing their camp, celebrating their victory, and preparing for the next phase of their invasion. Behind them, the beach was covered with the dead, hundreds of bodies marking the complete destruction of Tsushima's samurai defenders. Among the bodies walked a young woman named Yuna, searching for anything useful that the Mongols might have missed. Yuna was a thief and a survivor, someone who lived on the edges of society and did what was necessary to stay alive. She had learned young that the world was cruel, and that honor was a luxury for those who could afford it. She had been watching from hiding during the battle, horrified by the slaughter, but too practical to intervene. Now she moved carefully among the corpses, looking for coins or small valuables, anything she could trade for food or supplies. The Mongol conquest would bring chaos, and chaos created opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them. Yuna found Jin unconscious but alive, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She almost moved past him, not wanting to burden herself with a wounded samurai, but something made her pause. Perhaps it was simple compassion, or perhaps she recognized that saving a samurai's life might prove valuable later. She checked to ensure no Mongols were watching, then began the difficult task of dragging Jin away from the beach. He was heavy with armor and deadweight in his unconscious state. She had to remove some of his armor plates to make him lighter, working quickly and quietly while constantly checking for danger. It took Yuna hours to move Jin to a safe location, a small cave hidden among the rocks that lined the coast. She managed to bring him inside and hide the entrance with brush, creating a temporary shelter where he could recover without being discovered. She had medical supplies, herbs, and bandages that she had stolen or bartered for, and she used these to treat his most serious wounds. She cleaned cuts, bound injuries, and tried to make him comfortable. Then there was nothing to do but wait and hope that he would wake up, and that when he did, he would not be so injured that survival was impossible. Jin drifted in and out of consciousness the next day, his mind unable to fully grasp what had happened. When he finally woke with some clarity, the first thing he felt was pain, a deep ache that seemed to encompass his entire body. The second thing he felt was confusion. He was not on the beach. He was not dead. Someone had saved him. And as his eyes focused in the dim light of the cave, he saw Yuna sitting near the entrance, watching him with an expression that mixed wariness and curiosity. At first, Jean could barely speak, his throat dry and his body weak. Yuna gave him water, just small sips to avoid making him sick, and waited for him to gather his strength. When he could finally form words, his first questions were about the battle. What had happened? Where was Lord Shimura? How many had survived? Yuna's answers were gentle but honest. The battle had been a complete defeat. Almost all the samurai had been killed. Lord Shimura had been taken prisoner by the Mongol leader. Tsushima was now under Mongol control, with their forces spreading across the island, burning villages and killing anyone who resisted. The weight of this information was almost worse than Jin's physical injuries. Everything he had known, the entire world he had lived in, had been destroyed in a single afternoon. His fellow samurai were dead. His uncle was a prisoner. The people of Tsushima were being slaughtered, and he, Jin Sakai, had failed. He had been unable to make any difference in the battle, had been knocked unconscious, and left for dead while his brothers in arms perished around him. The shame of surviving when honor demanded he die was almost unbearable. According to everything he had been taught, he should have fought until death claimed him. His survival was itself a kind of dishonor. Yuna had little patience for this kind of thinking. She had saved Jin's life, and she had done so for a reason. The samurai were gone, defeated by enemies who did not care about honor or proper behavior. If Tsushima was to be saved, it would require new methods, new ways of thinking about warfare. Jin was alive, and that meant he could still fight. But he would have to fight differently than he had been taught, because traditional samurai tactics had already proven completely ineffective against the Mongols. Yuna understood this instinctively, and she began working to make Jin understand it as well. The recovery process was slow and painful. Jin's injuries were severe, including broken ribs, deep cuts, and extensive bruising. He could barely walk at first, and wielding a sword was out of the question. Yuna kept him hidden in the cave for nearly a week, bringing food and water while keeping watch for Mongol patrols. During this time, she told Jin about what was happening on the island. The Mongols were methodical in their occupation, establishing control over key locations and eliminating any potential resistance. They had taken Castle Shimura and were using it as their headquarters. Lord Shimura was being held there, alive but imprisoned, his fate uncertain. The Mongol leader was a man named Khotan Khan, and he commanded the invasion with intelligence and ruthlessness. Khotan was not simply a brutal warrior, though he was certainly capable of violence. He was a strategist who understood that conquering a population required more than military victory. He needed to break the spirit of the people, to make them believe that resistance was futile and that cooperation with Mongol rule was their only option. To achieve this, he used terror as a weapon, making examples of those who defied him while offering mercy to those who submitted. He understood samurai culture well enough to use it against them, exploiting their adherence to honor and predictable behavior. One of Khotan's first acts after taking control was to offer the samurai prisoners a choice. They could serve him and live, or they could maintain their honor and die. To a samurai, this was not really a choice at all. Honor was more important than life, and serving an enemy was unthinkable. Most prisoners refused Khotan's offer and were executed publicly. Their deaths meant to demonstrate both Mongol power and futility of samurai resistance. Lord Shimura was kept alive for different reasons. Khotan recognized that Shimura was respected and that his cooperation, if it could be obtained, would demoralize the population more effectively than his death. As Jin recovered, Yuna shared more of her own story. She was not from a samurai family, obviously. She had grown up in the lower classes, learning early that survival required flexibility and pragmatism. Her brother had joined a group of bandits, and she had followed him into that life, becoming skilled at theft and deception. She had no love for the samurai, who she saw as privileged warriors more concerned with their own honor than with protecting common people. The invasion had destroyed her life as much as anyone else's, but she saw it as an opportunity as much as a tragedy. If the old order was gone, perhaps something better could be built in its place. Yuna had her own reasons for wanting to fight the Mongols beyond simple patriotism. Her brother had been captured by the invaders, and she hoped to find a way to free him. She also wanted revenge for the destruction of her community and the deaths of people she had known. But more than these personal motivations, She recognized that Jin represented a tool she could use. A samurai, if he could be convinced to fight in new ways, might accomplish things that some of her station never could. She began working to shift Jin's thinking, challenging his assumptions about honor and proper behavior. Try and make him understand that defeating the Mongols would require abandoning the very code that defined him as a samurai. This was an incredibly difficult concept for Jin to accept. His entire identity was built on the foundation of Bushido. To abandon the code was to become something less than samurai, something without honor or worth. But Yuna was persistent, and Jin was desperate. The alternative to changing was to do nothing, to hide while his uncle remained in prison and his people were slaughtered. Slowly, reluctantly, Jin began to consider that maybe the rules he had always followed were not universal truths, but cultural practices, useful in some contexts but potentially fatal in others. Maybe honor was not always the highest good. Maybe survival and victory had their own value. When Jin was finally strong enough to move without assistance, Yuna began teaching him skills that no samurai would normally learn. She showed him how to move quietly, how to stay hidden, how to approach enemies without being detected. These were the skills of thieves and assassins, dishonorable methods that samurai despised. But they were also effective, allowing a single person to accomplish what groups of warriors could not. Jin was a poor student at first, his movements too direct and obvious, his instincts all wrong for stealth. But he was motivated, and he learned quickly. He had always been skilled at physical activities, and these new techniques, while foreign, were not beyond his ability to master. Yuna also taught Jin about the different types of Mongol soldiers and how they could be defeated. The Mongols used various unit types with different weapons and tactics. Understanding these differences was crucial to fighting them effectively. Some enemies carried shields that could block frontal attacks, but left them vulnerable from the sides or back. Others used spears that gave them reach advantage, but made them slow to react to close combat. The key was to identify enemy types quickly and use appropriate tactics rather than treating all enemies the same. Jin's first real test came when Yuna asked him to help rescue some prisoners the Mongols were holding in a small camp. This mission required everything Yuna had taught him. They could not simply attack the camp directly, as they were outnumbered and would be quickly overwhelmed. Instead, they approached at night, moving through shadows and using the terrain for cover. Jin killed his first enemy from behind, cutting the soldier's throat before he could raise an alarm. The kill was efficient and silent, and it made Jin feel sick. This was murder, not combat. There was no honor in killing an unaware opponent. But the alternative was to let the prisoners die, and that was unacceptable. They freed the prisoners, half a dozen peasants who had been captured during a village raid. These people were terrified and grateful, and they looked at Jin as a hero despite the dishonorable methods he had used. This reaction confused Jin. According to samurai thinking, he had acted shamefully, but these common people cared only about results. They were alive because of what he had done, and to them, that was all that mattered. This began to shift something in Jin's thinking, a small crack in the absolute certainty he had always felt about the code he followed. Over the following weeks, Jin and Yuna conducted more operations against the Mongols. Each mission required stealth, careful planning, and methods that violated samurai principles. Jin attacked enemies from behind, used poison to weaken groups before fighting them, set traps to kill soldiers without direct confrontation, and employed every advantage he could find. He was becoming skilled at this new way of fighting, but the internal cost was tremendous. Each dishonorable action felt like a betrayal of everything his uncle had taught him. Every principle his father had died for. He was winning battles, but he was losing himself in the process. The turning point came when Jin decided to use terror as a weapon, just as Khotan Khan was doing. If the Mongols could make the population afraid, then Jin could make the Mongols afraid. He began leaving signs of his presence, bodies arranged to send messages, survivors allowed to escape so they could spread stories. He started wearing a mask and dark clothing, creating a visual identity distinct from his samurai appearance. He wanted the Mongols to see him as something otherworldly, something impossible to fight or escape. He wanted them to fear the shadows, to see death in every dark corner. He was creating a legend, and that legend needed a name. The peasants started calling him the Ghost. They said he appeared from nowhere, killed Mongol soldiers, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. They said he could not be stopped or captured, that he was protected by spirits of the dead samurai who had fallen at Komoda Beach. These stories spread quickly, growing with each retelling until the ghost became a figure of myth. The Mongols began to fear him, and that fear made them less effective. Frightened soldiers made mistakes, became paranoid, and were easier to defeat. But becoming the ghost meant abandoning Jin Sakai the samurai. The two identities were incompatible. A samurai fought with honor in daylight, announcing himself and engaging enemies directly. The ghost fought with any method that worked, striking from shadows and disappearing before the enemy could respond. Jin was living a contradiction, and it was tearing him apart. He needed help, both practical assistance in fighting the Mongols and guidance in dealing with the moral complexities of his situation. Yuna could teach him tactics, but she could not help him reconcile his actions with his training. For that, he would need to find others who understood the samurai code, but could see beyond its limitations. Jin's search for allies led him across Tsushima, and in his travels, he encountered other survivors of the invasion, each dealing with the disaster in their own way. One of the first was Sensei Ishikawa, an archer of remarkable skill and a teacher who had trained many of the island's warriors. Ishikawa was old, in his 70s, but age had not diminished his abilities with a bow. He could shoot with accuracy that seemed impossible, hitting targets at distances where most archers could not even see clearly. Ishikawa had survived the invasion by being away from Komoda Beach when the battle occurred, and he had spent the weeks since trying to understand what had gone wrong and how to fight back. Ishikawa's story was complicated by a personal failure that haunted him. He had trained a student named Tomo, a female archer of extraordinary talent who had surpassed even Ishikawa's own abilities. But Tomo had become disillusioned with samurai culture and its treatment of women. She had been denied recognition for her skills simply because of her gender, relegated to a teaching role when she could have been one of the greatest warriors on the island. When the Mongols invaded, Tomo had seen an opportunity. She had joined them, using her abilities to train Mongol archers in advanced techniques. This betrayal devastated Ishikawa, who felt responsible for training someone who had turned against her own people. Ishikawa asked Jin to help him hunt down Tomo and stop her from teaching the Mongols. Jin agreed, partly because preventing the Mongols from improving their archery was strategically important, but also because he understood Ishikawa's pain. The pursuit of Tomo took them across the island, following clues and engaging Mongol forces trained in Japanese archery techniques. Each encounter showed how dangerous these hybrid soldiers were, combining Mongol tactics with Japanese precision. Eventually, they confronted Tomo herself, and the confrontation forced both Ishikawa and Jin to examine their assumptions about loyalty, honor, and the treatment of those who did not fit perfectly into society's expectations. Tomo's perspective challenged Jin's thinking about the invasion. She pointed out that the samurai had failed to protect the common people, that their obsession with honor had made them predictable and easy to defeat. She argued that the Mongol way of warfare, while brutal, was more honest than samurai pretensions. The Mongols did not pretend that warfare was noble or beautiful. They treated it as a practical necessity and used whatever methods brought victory. In Tomo's view, this pragmatism was actually more honorable than following rules that led to defeat and the deaths of innocent people. Jin could not fully accept Tomo's arguments, but neither could he completely reject them. He was living proof that traditional methods were insufficient. He had become the ghost precisely because samurai tactics had failed. His own actions contradicted the code he still claimed to follow. The conversation with Tomo planted seeds of doubt that would continue to grow, forcing Jin to question not just how he fought, but why he fought and what he hoped to achieve. Was he trying to restore the old order, or was he creating something new? Could honor survive if it required abandoning honor to defend it? Another ally Jin found was Lady Masako, a samurai warrior and one of the few members of her clan to survive the invasion. Masako's story was one of devastating personal loss. Her entire family had been murdered, not by Mongols, but by someone within the samurai community. She had returned home after the battle to find her husband, children, and household staff all dead, killed with precision that indicated samurai training. In addition to fighting the Mongols, Masako was pursuing a personal quest for vengeance, hunting down those responsible for destroying her family. She was driven by grief and rage, emotions that made her both a powerful ally and someone who might make reckless decisions in pursuit of revenge. Masako's story revealed dark secrets about samurai society, including political conflicts that had existed before the invasion. Her family had been killed because of disputes over territory and influence, petty power struggles that seemed monstrously insignificant in the context of the Mongol conquest. The killers had used the chaos of the invasion to settle old scores, believing their crimes would be attributed to the enemy. Masako's pursuit of justice took Jin deep into the politics of the samurai clans, showing him that the warrior class he idealized was not as united or noble as he had believed. Working with Masako meant helping her track down and confront the conspirators one by one. These confrontations were difficult because the enemies were samurai, people who in other circumstances would have been allies. Fighting and killing other samurai felt different from killing Mongol invaders. These were men Jin might have known, whose families he might have met, who followed the same code and served the same ideals. But they had committed terrible crimes, and Masako's quest for vengeance was justified by any reasonable standard. Jin found himself in the uncomfortable position of acting as judge and executioner against members of his own class, further blurring the lines between honor and dishonor, justice and murder. Masako's approach to combat was interesting because she fought as a samurai, but with a personal intensity that went beyond formal training. Her grief had sharpened her skills, giving her a desperate ferocity that made her incredibly dangerous. She was not interested in showing mercy or in offering defeated enemies a chance to die with dignity. She wanted them to suffer as her family had suffered, and she was willing to use methods that other samurai would have considered excessive. Her example showed Jin that even those who claimed to follow the code perfectly could abandon it when personal stakes were high enough. As Jin gathered these allies and others, he began to build a resistance movement. It was not an army in the traditional sense, as they did not have the numbers or resources for conventional warfare. Instead, it was a network of fighters who used guerrilla tactics to harass the Mongols, disrupt their operations, and gradually weaken their control over the island. They ambushed patrols, sabotaged supply lines, liberated prisoners, and assassinated officers. Each small victory boosted the morale of the civilian population and demonstrated that the Mongols were not invincible. The ghost became a symbol of resistance, proof that the fight was not over despite the devastating defeat at Komoda Beach. But this resistance came at a cost. Every attack Jin conducted moved him further from the samurai ideal. He was using fear as a weapon, killing from shadows, poisoning enemies, and employing tactics that would have horrified his younger self. He was becoming effective, but effectiveness required compromise. The question that haunted him was how much compromise was acceptable. At what point did the methods become so dishonorable that even victory would be meaningless? If he defeated the Mongols by becoming as ruthless as them, what would he have actually saved? These questions had no easy answers, and Jin struggled with them every day. The psychological toll of Jin's double life was significant. He was Jin Sakai when he interacted with other samurai or tried to maintain some connection to his old identity, but he was the ghost when he fought the Mongols. These two identities pulled him in opposite directions, creating internal conflict that never fully resolved. The samurai part of him felt shame at the dishonorable methods he employed. The ghost part of him felt impatient with rules that served no practical purpose. Living between these extremes was exhausting, and there was no one who could fully understand what he was experiencing. Yuna came closest understanding, but she had never followed the samurai code, and so could not fully grasp what Jin was giving up. To her, his internal struggle seemed pointless. The Mongols were the enemy, and whatever defeated them was justified. The philosophical questions that tormented Jin seemed like self-indulgent distractions from the practical work of resistance. She appreciated Jin's skills and his willingness to use them, but she had limited patience for his ongoing crisis of conscience. Her pragmatic perspective was valuable, but also meant she could not provide the moral support Jin needed. The other samurai Jin encountered during his travels had mixed reactions to his methods. Some were horrified and viewed him as a traitor to Bushido. Others grudgingly admitted that his tactics were effective even if dishonorable. A few recognized that desperate times required desperate measures and supported his approach, while privately struggling with their own doubts. The samurai community, what little remained of it, was fracturing under the pressure of the invasion. with different individuals choosing different responses to an impossible situation. One of the most important allies Jin recruited was a monk named Norio, who led a small group of warrior monks committed to protecting the Buddhist temples scattered across Tsushima. Norio and his followers were not samurai, but they had combat training and a fierce dedication to their faith and community. The Mongols had been systematically destroying temples and killing monks, viewing them as symbols of Japanese culture that needed to be eliminated. Norio had watched many of his brothers die, and his grief had transformed into determination to fight back. Norio's perspective on honor was different from a samurai's, but equally rigid. He believed in Buddhist principles of compassion and nonviolence, yet he was willing to kill to protect his community. This contradiction troubled him deeply, creating a spiritual crisis that paralleled Jin's moral one. Norio struggled with the question of whether violence in defense of others was justified, or whether it simply created more suffering and continued cycles of revenge. He ultimately decided that protecting the innocent was worth the karmic cost of his own soul, accepting that he might be damned for his choices, but making them anyway. Working with Norio meant helping defend temples and rescue monks from Mongol attacks. These missions often required the same stealth tactics Jin had developed, approaching enemy positions quietly and eliminating threats before they could harm civilians. Norio participated in these operations with visible discomfort, clearly hating what he was doing even as he acknowledged its necessity. His presence reminded Jin that he was not alone in struggling with the moral weight of his actions. Others were making similar compromises, sacrificing their own spiritual well-being for the sake of those they protected. The temples themselves were beautiful structures that represented centuries of artistic and spiritual tradition. They were built with careful attention to harmony with nature, positioned in locations of natural beauty, and designed to inspire contemplation. The Mongols' destruction of these spaces was particularly cruel because it targeted not just physical structures, but the cultural identity they represented. Each burned temple was an erasure of history, a deliberate attempt to break the spirit of the population by destroying connections to their past. Jin also worked with a merchant named Kenji who had turned to sake smuggling and minor criminal enterprises to survive the invasion. Kenji was entirely self-interested, motivated by profit rather than patriotism, but he had information and resources that made him valuable. He knew smuggling routes that avoided Mongol patrols, had contact among the criminal underground, and understood the black market economy that had developed under the occupation. Kenji was happy to help Jin as long as there was money or advantage in it, and Jin was willing to use Kenji's services despite finding the man's mercenary attitude distasteful. Kenji's perspective on the war was cynical, but not entirely wrong. He pointed out that wars were fought by common people at the command of nobles who rarely suffered directly. The samurai had failed to protect Tsushima, yet they still claimed authority and demanded respect. The Mongols were brutal occupiers, but they also brought trade opportunities and disrupted the old social hierarchy in ways that benefited some peasants. Kenji saw the invasion as simply another change in circumstances to be navigated for personal advantage. His amoral pragmatism was repulsive to Jin's samurai sensibilities, but also reflected a reality that Jin had to acknowledge. Not everyone viewed the conflict through the lens of honor and duty. For many people, survival and prosperity were more important than abstract principles. Through Kenji, Jin gained access to black market weapons and supplies, including materials for making poisons and explosives. These were tools that no honorable samurai would use, but they were effective force multipliers for someone fighting alone or in small groups against superior numbers. Jin learned to craft various types of arrows, bombs, and poisons, each designed for specific tactical situations. A bomb could clear out a group of enemies, creating chaos that allowed Jin to strike vulnerable targets. Poison could weaken opponents before combat, making them easier to defeat. These were cowards' weapons according to samurai thinking, but they saved Jin's life repeatedly. As Jin's reputation grew, so did the attention he received from Khotan Khan. The Mongol leader was increasingly frustrated by the ghost attacks and the damage they were doing to control the island. Khotan was not accustomed to prolonged resistance. His previous conquests had been more straightforward, with populations accepting defeat after initial military victories. The Japanese were proving more stubborn, and Jin specifically was becoming a serious problem. Khoten began devoting resources specifically to capturing or killing the ghost, assigning skill trackers and elite soldiers to the task. Khoten's approach to Jin was interesting because he recognized the samurai's skills and saw potential value in turning him rather than simply killing him. Khoten sent messages through intermediaries, offering Jin a position in the Mongol forces if he would submit and use his abilities in service of the Khan. These offers were genuine in their own way. Khoten appreciated talent and was willing to overlook ethnic differences if someone proved themselves useful. To Khoten, loyalty was practical rather than racial or cultural. If Jin could be convinced that serving the Mongols would bring better outcomes for Tsushima than continuing feudal resistance, then recruitment was better than execution. Jin rejected these offers without serious consideration, but they did make him think about Khoten's motivations. The Mongol leader was not simply evil or mindlessly destructive. He was trying to build an empire, to bring diverse peoples under unified rule. From Khoten's perspective, he was creating order from chaos, establishing systems that would ultimately benefit everyone. The violence and terror were tools used to achieve these goals quickly, minimizing prolonged conflict. Khoten likely believed he was doing something positive in the long term, even if his methods in the short term were brutal. This did not make him any less an enemy, but it made him a more complex one than simple hatred would suggest. The relationship between Jin and Khoten developed into a personal rivalry that went beyond simple military opposition. They understood each other in important ways, both being warriors of exceptional skill who were willing to break conventional rules to achieve victory. Khoten respected Jin's abilities even while trying to kill him. Jin recognized Khoten's intelligence even while fighting to drive him from Tsushima. Their eventual confrontation would be personal, a clash between two men who represented different philosophies of power and different visions for the island's future. As weeks turned to months, Jin's campaign against the Mongols achieved significant results. He had disrupted their occupation, freed hundreds of prisoners, eliminated numerous officers and skilled soldiers, and inspired widespread resistance among the civilian population. But strategic success came with personal costs. Jin was exhausted, physically from constant combat and injuries, and mentally from the moral weight of his choices. He had nightmares about the men he had killed, dreams where their faces accused him of dishonor and murder. He wondered what his father would think of the warrior he had become, whether the man who had died honorably would be ashamed of the son who fought from shadows. The question of Lord Shimura's captivity haunted Jin constantly. His uncle remained imprisoned in Castle Shimura, kept alive by Khoten for reasons that were not entirely clear. Jin desperately wanted to rescue him, but the castle was too heavily defended for a direct assault. Any attempt to free Lord Shimura would require careful planning and probably significant help. As Jin's network of allies grew, the possibility of mounting a rescue operation became more realistic. But with that possibility came anxiety about what Lord Shimura would think when he learned how Jin had been fighting. The uncle who had raised Jin and taught him the samurai code would surely be horrified by the methods his nephew had employed. Jin's fears were confirmed when he finally managed to infiltrate Castle Shimura and reach his uncle's cell. The reunion was emotional but complicated. Lord Shimura was overjoyed to see Jin alive, having believed his nephew had died at Komoda Beach. But as Jin explained his survival and described his subsequent actions, he watched his uncle's expression shift from joy to confusion to growing horror. Everything Jin described violated the code that Lord Shimura held sacred. The stealth attacks, the assassinations, the use of poison and fear, all of it was dishonorable in ways that Lord Shimura could barely comprehend. The conversation between Jin and Lord Shimura became an argument about fundamentals. Lord Shimura insisted that honor was more important than victory, that how one fought mattered as much as whether one won. Jin argued that honor was meaningless if everyone who tried to uphold it died, that the Mongols had proven traditional methods were inadequate. Lord Shimura countered that abandoning the code meant becoming no better than the invaders, that preserving Japanese culture required maintaining Japanese values. Jin responded that culture could not be preserved if the people who carried it were all killed. They were both right and both wrong, arguing from different premises that did not allow for compromise. The fundamental disagreement between them centered on whether codes of behavior were absolute moral truths or contextual practices. Lord Shimura believed Bushido represented universal principles that transcended circumstances. Following the code was inherently right, and violating it was inherently wrong, regardless of outcomes. Jin had come to believe that principles needed to be evaluated based on their consequences. A code that led to the destruction of everything it was meant to protect was not serving its purpose and needed to be modified. Neither man could convince the other, because they were operating from incompatible philosophical frameworks. Despite their disagreement, Lord Shimura and Jin worked together to escape from Castle Shimura. The rescue operation required exactly the kind of stealth and deception that Lord Shimura condemned, but he participated because the immediate necessity overrode his objections. The experience of sneaking through his own castle, hiding from guards, and assassinating sentries from behind was deeply disturbing for Lord Shimura. Every action violated his sense of proper conduct, yet he could not deny that these methods succeeded where honorable approaches would have failed. The internal conflict this created was visible in his face, disgust and pragmatic acceptance warring with each other. Once they escaped and rejoined Jin's allies, Lord Shimura began trying to reassert traditional samurai leadership. He believed that with his authority and Jin's network of contacts, they could organize a proper military response to the Mongols. He wanted to gather the remaining samurai and loyal soldiers, establish conventional command structures, and engage the enemy in open battle. Jin tried to explain that this approach had already failed catastrophically at Komoda Beach and would fail again. The Mongols were too numerous and too skilled at conventional warfare. The only successful strategy was continued guerrilla operations until help arrived from the mainland or until the Mongols' position became untenable. Lord Shimura refused to accept this logic. In his view, Jin's methods had been a necessary evil during a period when there was no legitimate authority to coordinate resistance. Now that he was free, proper order could be restored. He began issuing commands and expecting obedience, trying to reimpose the hierarchical structure that had existed before the invasion. Some of Jin's allies responded positively to this, relieved to have traditional leadership again. Others, particularly those from lower social classes like Yuna and Kenji, were resistant or openly hostile. They had no loyalty to Lord Shimura and saw his return as potentially undermining the effective resistance they had built. The tension between Jin's approach and Lord Shimura's vision created fractures in the resistance movement. People were forced to choose between following the traditional authority figure or continuing the methods that had been working. Jin found himself in an impossible position. He loved and respected his uncle, wanted to defer his authority as filial duty and samurai culture demanded. But he also believed that following Lord Shimura's plan would lead to disaster, that reverting to traditional tactics would waste all the progress they had made and result in more deaths. For the first time in his life, Jin had to seriously consider disobeying his uncle and lord, choosing his own judgment over legitimate authority. The crisis came to a head when Lord Shimura announced his intention to challenge Khoten Khan to single combat, a formal duel that would settle the conflict honorably. This was classic samurai thinking, that wars could be decided by the champions of each side fighting according to agreed rules. Lord Shimura believed that if he could defeat Khoten in fair combat, the Mongol forces would respect the outcome and withdraw from Tsushima. Jin tried to explain that this was a fantasy, that the Mongols did not think that way and would not honor such an arrangement. But Lord Shimura was convinced that this was the correct course, and that honor demanded he pursue it. Jin knew that allowing this challenge to proceed would be suicidal. Khoten Khan had no reason to fight fairly and every reason to use the opportunity to eliminate Lord Shimura while gaining intelligence about samurai positions and strength. The entire plan was based on assumptions about shared values that the Mongols demonstrably did not hold. But preventing the challenge meant openly defying Lord Shimura, taking action against his uncle's direct orders. It meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, breaking the bonds of loyalty and obedience that defined the samurai relationship between lord and retainer. Jin chose to act against Lord Shimura's wishes. He gathered allies and launched an operation to disrupt the planned duel, attacking the Mongol position before Lord Shimura could arrive. The attack was successful in military terms, killing many Mongol soldiers and forcing Khoten to retreat. But it was a complete betrayal of Lord Shimura's authority, an act of insubordination that could not be forgiven or forgotten. When Lord Shimura learned what Jin had done, his reaction was one of profound disappointment mixed with anger. He had lost face, been made to look foolish, and had his authority publicly challenged by his own nephew. The relationship between them, already strained, became openly hostile. From Lord Shimura's perspective, Jin had become a criminal who needed to be stopped almost as much as the Mongols themselves. By rejecting samurai authority and the code of honor, Jin was destroying Japanese culture from within, doing Khoten's work for him. Lord Shimura began speaking about Jin with regret and sorrow, calling the ghost as an insult rather than a title, suggesting that Jin had become something inhuman and monstrous. The language was harsh, but reflected genuine anguish. Lord Shimura had raised Jin from childhood, had taught him everything, had planned for him to inherit the Jito position. Watching Jin abandon everything he had been taught was like watching his own failure manifest, a rejection of his life's work and values. Jin understood his uncle's pain, but could not act differently. Too much was at stake, and the evidence was overwhelming that traditional methods would not work against the Mongols. He continued his campaign, now operating not just against the invaders, but also against his uncle's attempts to reimpose conventional tactics. The resistance movement split into factions, those loyal to Lord Shimura and those who followed Jin. This division weakened the overall effort and created opportunities for the Mongols to exploit, showing that both approaches had costs. Unity would have been better than correctness, but unity was impossible when fundamental disagreements could not be resolved. The breaking point approached as Jin prepared for a final push to drive the Mongols from Tsushima. He had gathered allies from across the island, convinced several samurai to join despite Lord Shimura's opposition, and planned a series of coordinated attacks that would strike multiple Mongol positions simultaneously. The strategy was sound and had a reasonable chance of success if everyone cooperated. But Lord Shimura refused to participate in an operation that relied on dishonorable tactics. He withdrew his supporters and essentially declared Jin an outlaw, someone who would face judgment for his crimes once the Mongol threat was dealt with. This declaration put Jin in an impossible position legally and morally. He was now actively working against his lord's orders, behavior that by traditional standards deserved death. He had broken the fundamental samurai obligation of loyalty, becoming a traitor regardless of his motivations or the outcomes of his actions. The fact that he was fighting to save Tsushima did not excuse the means he had chosen. Honor required obedience, and he had chosen effectiveness over obedience. He had become exactly what Lord Shimura accused him of being, a warrior without honor, someone who followed no code but his own judgment. Yet Jin could not stop. The Mongols remained the primary threat, and defeating them required continuing on a path he had chosen. He launched his coordinated attacks with those allies who still supported him, striking Mongol positions across the island in a campaign designed to break their hold on Tsushima once and for all. The battles were fierce and costly, with significant casualties on both sides. Jin fought with the desperation of someone who knew this might be his last chance, using every skill and tactic he had developed. He was a ghost fully now, no longer trying to maintain any connection to his samurai identity. The final confrontation with Khoten Khan was inevitable, a meeting between the two men who had shaped the conflict through their actions and philosophies. They met in a destroyed temple, a location symbolic of what the war had cost both sides. The temple had been beautiful once, a place of peace and contemplation. Now it was burned and broken, its spiritual purpose corrupted by violence. The setting reflected both men, warriors who had compromised their values in pursuit of victory, who carried the weight of decisions that could never be undone. Khoten greeted Jin with respect, acknowledging the ghost's skill and the damage he had done to the Mongol occupation. The Khan offered one final opportunity for Jin to join the Mongol side, arguing that they were more alike than different. Both had recognized that traditional rules were inadequate, that survival required adaptation. Both had been willing to break sacred codes when necessary. Khoten suggested that they could accomplish more working together than as enemies, that Jin's talents were wasted in service of a dying culture that had already rejected him. Jin rejected the offer without hesitation, despite recognizing some truth in Khoten's words. Yes, he had broken with tradition and been condemned for it. Yes, he and Khoten were similar in their willingness to use any method to achieve their goals. But there was a fundamental difference in what they fought for. Khotan fought for conquest and empire, for the expansion of power and the subjugation of peoples. Jin fought to protect his home and the people who lived there, to preserve a way of life even if he had been forced to compromise that way of life in defending it. The distinction mattered, even if the methods were sometimes similar. The duel between Jin and Khotan was brutal and personal, two skilled warriors fighting with everything they had. Khotan was a formidable opponent, strong and fast with decades of combat experience against diverse enemies. He used techniques Jin had never seen, combinations of Mongol and Chinese martial arts that were highly effective. Jin responded with his own hybrid style, mixing samurai sword work with the stealth tactics and dirty fighting he had learned from Yuna and developed through necessity. The battle was not elegant or honorable, but a desperate struggle where both men fought to kill. Jin ultimately prevailed, delivering a fatal wound that left Khotan dying on the temple floor. The victory was complete in military terms. The Khan was dead, and without his leadership, the Mongol forces on Tsushima began to collapse. Officers competed for command, creating confusion and breaking the unified front that had made the Mongols so effective. The invasion was failing, and the island would be liberated. Jin had accomplished what seemed impossible, defeating a vastly superior force through determination, innovation, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary. But the victory fell hollow. Jin stood over Khotan's body, exhausted and injured, realizing that he had won the war but lost himself in the process. The man he had been at Komoda Beach, the samurai who believed in honor and proper conduct, was gone. The ghost remained, a warrior defined by necessity rather than principle, someone who had sacrificed his identity to protect others. He had saved Tsushima, but at a cost that could never be repaid. The question that haunted him was whether the cost had been worth it, whether the island he had saved was still worth living in, or whether he had destroyed the very thing he fought to protect. The aftermath of Khotan's death brought new complications rather than simple resolution. The Mongol forces retreated from Tsushima, but they did not withdraw entirely from the region. The invasion had failed in its immediate objective, but the Mongol Empire remained powerful and would likely attempt future incursions. The shogun on the mainland was already preparing for further attacks, building defenses and reorganizing military forces to meet this new type of threat. Jin's tactics and the lessons learned from fighting the Mongols would influence Japanese military thinking going forward, though he would likely receive no credit for these innovations. Lord Shimura survived the conflict and immediately moved to restore order according to traditional principles. His first priority was dealing with Jin, who had committed serious crimes regardless of the outcome of his actions. In Lord Shimura's view, Jin needed to be held accountable for breaking the samurai code, for acting dishonorably, and for defying legitimate authority. The proper punishment for such crimes was death by seppuku, ritual suicide that would at least restore some measure of honor to Jin's name and family. Lord Shimura did not want Jin to die, but he believed that duty and tradition demanded this outcome. The final confrontation between Jin and Lord Shimura was even more painful than the battle with Khotan Khan. They met in a field overlooking the ocean, the same ocean that had brought the Mongols but was now beautiful and peaceful again in the evening light. Lord Shimura offered Jin the choice of dying honorably by his own hand or being executed as a criminal. Neither option was acceptable to Jin, who believed he had done nothing wrong and certainly deserved no punishment for saving the island. But refusing Lord Shimura's judgment meant continuing his rebellion against samurai authority, confirming everything his uncle believed about him. The conversation that followed explored the unbridgeable gap between their worldviews. Lord Shimura could not accept that circumstances justified abandoning honor. In his understanding, moral principles were absolute, not conditional. If breaking the code produced good results in this case, it would encourage others to break the code in future cases, leading to gradual erosion of everything that made samurai society functional. The code had to be maintained even when doing so was difficult or costly, because the alternative was chaos and the loss of social cohesion. Individual cases could not override general principles without destroying the system entirely. Jin argued from consequences rather than principles. He pointed to the specific situation they had faced, the immediate threat that required immediate action. The Mongols had not cared about samurai honor, and fighting honorably had led to catastrophic defeat. Adapting to circumstances and using effective tactics had succeeded where traditional methods failed. The results spoke for themselves. Tsushima was free because Jin had been willing to do what was necessary, even when that meant breaking rules. Maintaining the code while everyone died was not noble. It was stupid and wasteful. Neither man could convince the other because they were arguing about fundamentals that could not be proven or disproven. Was honor intrinsically valuable, or was it only valuable when it produced good outcomes? Were moral rules discovered universal truths, or were they created human practices that could be modified? These questions have been debated by philosophers for thousands of years without definitive resolution. Jin and Lord Shimura were not philosophers, just two men shaped by their experiences and unable to see past their own perspectives. Lord Shimura ultimately decided that if Jin would not choose honor, then honor would be enforced through execution. He drew his sword and prepared to kill his nephew personally, fulfilling his duty as Jito and as the head of Clan Sakai. Jin did not want to fight his uncle, but he also would not simply accept death for crimes he did not believe he had committed. He defended himself, and the two men fought with deep sorrow rather than anger. Every blow was an acknowledgement of failure, a recognition that their relationship had been destroyed by forces beyond their control. The fight ended with Jin victorious but devastated. He had defeated his uncle without killing him, disarming Lord Shimura and leaving him alive but humiliated. This mercy was itself an insult according to samurai thinking, suggesting that Lord Shimura was not worthy of being killed as an equal. Jin meant it as compassion, as a refusal to kill someone he loved. But Lord Shimura experienced it as contempt, as Jin treated him like a child or a peasant who was beneath serious consideration. The gap between intention and reception illustrated how completely their relationship had broken down. Jin left the field alone, walking away from his uncle, his clan, and his identity as a samurai. He was a ghost now permanently, a warrior without a place in society, someone who existed outside the normal structures of authority and obligation. He had saved Tsushima but had no home there anymore. The people might tell stories about him, might admire what he had accomplished, but he could never return to normal life. He had become a symbol rather than a person, a legend rather than a member of the community. The price of his choices was exile from everything familiar, a loneliness that would follow him for the rest of his life. The broader implications of Jin's story extended beyond his personal tragedy. He had demonstrated that Japanese forces could defeat the Mongols, but only by abandoning traditional tactics and adopting new methods. This lesson was not lost on military leaders who began to rethink their approach to warfare. The strict adherence to honor and formal combat that had served samurai well in internal conflicts proved inadequate against external enemies who did not share Japanese cultural assumptions. Future defenders would need to be more flexible, more willing to use whatever tactics the situation required. The social impact was equally significant. Jin's actions had been successful despite being dishonorable, raising questions about whether the code of Bushido was truly absolute or whether it was simply one cultural practice among many. Peasants and lower-class individuals who had participated in the resistance had proven themselves capable and brave, challenging the assumption that only samurai were qualified to be warriors. The rigid social hierarchies that had seemed natural and inevitable before the invasion were revealed to be constructed systems that could be questioned and potentially changed. The story of the ghost became folklore, spreading beyond Tsushima to other parts of Japan. Different versions of the story emphasized different aspects. Some versions portrayed Jin as a tragic hero who sacrificed his honor to save his people, a noble figure brought low by circumstances. Other versions presented him as a dangerous radical who had rejected rightful authority and needed to be contained. Still other versions celebrated him as a liberator who had shown that common people could fight against injustice regardless of social position. The multiplicity of interpretations reflected the complexity of what Jin had done and the impossibility of reducing his choices to simple judgments. For Yuna and the other common people who had fought alongside Jin, the aftermath was complicated. They had participated in a successful resistance, had proven their own courage and capability, but the victory returned them to a social system that still denied them power or respect. The samurai were back in charge, and Lord Shimura was already working to reassert traditional hierarchies. Yuna had hoped that the shared experience of fighting together might break down some class barriers, but she quickly realized that the old order was resilient. Those in power were not interested in sharing authority with those who had been their tools. Yuna's brother, whose capture had been one of her motivations for joining the resistance, survived the occupation but was changed by his experiences. He had seen and done things during his captivity that left him with deep trauma, and he struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Yuna tried to help him, but she carried her own wounds from the war, psychological scars that did not heal simply because the fighting stopped. The victory over the Mongols was real, but it did not erase the cost that individuals had paid to achieve it. Sensei Ishikawa continued his work as an archery teacher, but he was forever marked by Tomo's betrayal and the questions it raised about his own teaching and judgment. He had trained a warrior of exceptional skill who had used those skills against her own people. This failure haunted him, making him question whether he truly understood anything about honor, loyalty, or how to develop these qualities in students. He became more cautious and conservative in his teaching, reluctant to train anyone who showed signs of independence or questioning. Lady Masako achieved her revenge against those who had murdered her family, but the satisfaction she expected never materialized. Killing the conspirators did not bring her family back or ease her grief. She was left alone, the last of her clan, with nothing but memories and an uncertain future. She had been defined by her quest for vengeance, and with that quest completed, she struggled to find new purpose. The emptiness that followed achievement of her goal was in some ways worse than the pain that had driven her. Norio and the surviving warrior monks worked to rebuild the temples that had been destroyed, but they could not restore the sense of sanctity that had been lost. The spaces had been violated, used for violence, and that spiritual contamination was difficult to cleanse. Norio personally struggled with the karmic weight of the men he had killed, questioning whether his actions had been justified and whether he could still consider himself a monk. He continued his religious practices, but with a sense of distance, going through motions that no longer carried the meaning they once had. The temples themselves became different spaces after the war. They were no longer just places of worship and contemplation, but also memorials to those who had died. People visited them seeking connection with lost loved ones, wanting to believe that the spirits of the dead found peace in these sacred places. The monks accommodated this desire, adding rituals and practices that honored the dead and provided comfort to the living. The Buddhism practiced after the invasion was more somber, more focused on death and suffering, reflecting the trauma the community had experienced. Kenji profited from the reconstruction, using his networks and knowledge of trade to position himself as a key figure in rebuilding the economy. He showed no moral conflict about his role, viewing it simply as good business. The destruction had created demand for goods and services, and he was positioned to supply those needs. His prosperity contrasted with the poverty many others experienced, creating resentment but also grudging respect for his abilities. Kenji represented a kind of survivor who succeeded regardless of circumstances, morally questionable but practically effective. The question of how to remember the invasion and the resistance became politically charged. Lord Shimura and the samurai leadership wanted to emphasize traditional values, portraying the conflict as a story of samurai honor defending Japanese culture against barbarism. Jin's role was minimized or reframed, his dishonorable tactics downplayed while his samurai background was emphasized. This version of events served the interests of those in power, reinforcing their authority and the importance of maintaining social hierarchies. An alternative narrative existed among common people, who remembered the ghost as a champion of the oppressed who had been willing to defy authority to protect them. In this telling, Jin represented a challenge to the rigid class system, proof that honor and effectiveness were not synonymous, and that samurai codes sometimes served the interests of the elite rather than the good of everyone. This version of the story was subversive, suggesting that the existing social order might not be natural or inevitable. Those who told this version risked official disapproval, but kept the story alive anyway. The physical landscape of Tsushima bore permanent marks from the invasion. Burned villages were rebuilt, but not always in the same locations or configurations. Some communities that had been destroyed were never reestablished, their inhabitants absorbed into other settlements or moved to different parts of the island. The distribution of population shifted, with people moving away from the western coast where the Mongols had landed, seeking safety inland or in the more defensible eastern regions. These demographic changes altered the island's character in subtle but lasting ways. The battlefields, including Komoda Beach where the initial disaster had occurred, became sites of remembrance. Markers were placed to honor the dead, and annual ceremonies commemorated the sacrifice of those who had fallen. These rituals served multiple purposes, honoring the past while also reinforcing particular interpretations of events. The ceremonies emphasized courage and honor, portraying the dead as heroes rather than as victims of inadequate tactics and preparation. This framing was comforting but also historically incomplete, simplifying complex events into myths that served present needs. The weapons and tactics Jean had developed continued to be used despite official disapproval. Individual warriors who had seen their effectiveness were not willing to abandon methods that worked simply because they violated tradition. This created tension between public rhetoric that praised honor and private practice that valued results. People learned to maintain appearances while doing what they needed to do, a kind of social hypocrisy that allowed both tradition and innovation to coexist uncomfortably. The use of poison in warfare, which Jean had normalized through his example, became particularly controversial. Official samurai doctrine condemned it as dishonorable, but warriors continued to carry poisoned weapons because they provided significant tactical advantages. This gap between stated principles and actual practice revealed the difficulty of maintaining rigid moral codes when circumstances pressured people to compromise. The poison controversy exemplified broader questions about the relationship between ideals and reality, between what people claimed to believe and what they actually did. Training methods began to incorporate some lessons from fighting the Mongols, though this was done quietly to avoid appearing to endorse dishonorable tactics. Young warriors learned about the importance of adaptability, about studying enemy methods, about not assuming that all opponents would fight according to familiar rules. These lessons were framed in ways that did not explicitly contradict Bushido, but the underlying message was clear. Survival sometimes required flexibility that the traditional code did not accommodate. The next generation of samurai would be subtly different from their predecessors, more pragmatic even if they still professed the same values. For Jean personally, the years after the invasion were lonely and uncertain. He could not return to his old life, could not reclaim the identity he had abandoned. He was famous as a ghost but infamous as Jin Sakai, both celebrated and condemned depending on who was telling the story. He traveled Tsushima helping people when he could, intervening in situations where his skills were needed, always moving to avoid staying anywhere long enough to be caught. He became a wandering ronin, a masterless samurai who existed outside normal social structures, neither fully accepted nor completely rejected. Jin's relationship with his legend was complicated. The ghost had taken on a life of its own in stories and songs, becoming a symbol that meant different things to different people. The real Jin struggled to see himself in these stories. He had made choices based on desperate circumstances, trying to save lives and protect his home. He had not set out to become a revolutionary or a symbol of anything, but intentions did not control outcomes, and the meaning of his actions was no longer entirely within his control. He had become public property in a sense, and the public created its own versions of who he was and what he represented. The internal conflict that had driven much of Jin's journey never fully resolved. He continued to struggle with questions about whether his methods had been justified, whether the costs had been worth the benefits, whether he could have found a different path that preserved both effectiveness and honor. These questions had no definitive answers, and Jin learned to live with uncertainty rather than achieving the clarity he craved. The ambiguity was uncomfortable, but perhaps more honest than the absolute certainties he had believed in his youth. Jin's combat skills evolved even after the invasion ended. He continued to refine his techniques, blending samurai fundamentals with the improvisational tactics he had developed fighting the Mongols. His style became uniquely his own, recognizable to those who had seen him fight, but impossible to categorize according to traditional schools. He was self-taught in many ways, having abandoned formal instruction in favor of practical experimentation. This made him unpredictable, which was a significant advantage in combat, but also marked him as an outsider to established martial arts traditions. The psychological scars of the war manifested in various ways. Jin had nightmares frequently, dreams where he was back on Komoda Beach watching the samurai fall, unable to change the outcome no matter what he did. He also dreamed about the men he had killed, particularly those he had assassinated from behind or poisoned. These victims haunted him more than those he had fought face to face, perhaps because killing them had felt like murder rather than combat. He carried guilt that he could not fully process or resolve, a burden that grew heavier rather than lighter with time. Gene found himself avoiding close relationships after the war. The pain of his break with Lord Shimura had taught him the danger of loving someone whose values differed fundamentally from his own. The loss of his fellow samurai at Komoda Beach had shown him the impermanence of community and belonging. He protected himself by maintaining distance, helping people without forming lasting bonds. This isolation was both a defense mechanism and a punishment he inflicted on himself, a way of ensuring he could not hurt or be hurt by those he cared about. The few times Gene encountered people who recognized him as Gene Sakai rather than just hearing stories about the ghost, their reactions varied dramatically. Some treated him as a hero, expressing gratitude for what he had done and offering whatever assistance they could provide. Others viewed him with fear or disapproval, seeing him as a criminal or a dangerous radical. Still others looked at him with pity, recognizing the price he had paid and the isolation his choices had created. Gene found all of these reactions uncomfortable, preferring anonymity to recognition. The changing seasons on Tsushima took on new meaning for Gene after the invasion. Spring brought memories of innocence and the world before the Mongols arrived. Summer reminded him of the heat of battle and the urgency of the resistance. Autumn was the season of the invasion itself, and every year when the leaves turned, he remembered Komoda Beach and the beginning of his transformation. Winter represented the cold reality of his current existence, alone and without clear purpose beyond immediate survival and helping where he could. The natural beauty of the island remained a source of comfort despite everything. Gene spent hours walking through forests and along coastlines, finding peace in the constancy of nature. Trees grew whether samurai followed honor codes or not. Waves crashed against rocks regardless of political conflicts. Birds sang without concern for human troubles. This perspective was both comforting and disturbing, a reminder that the things humans fought over so desperately mattered little in the broader scope of existence. Gene developed a deeper appreciation for ordinary moments and simple pleasures after the war. A warm meal, a safe place to sleep, a conversation with someone who did not judge him. These became precious in ways they never had been when he was young and comfortable. He had lost the security and certainty of his previous life, but had gained a different kind of wisdom, an understanding of what truly mattered and what was merely social convention. Whether this trade was worthwhile remained an open question. The spiritual dimension of Jin's experience was complex. He had been raised with both Buddhist and Shinto influences, as was common in Japan. The Buddhist teachings about suffering, impermanence, and the importance of letting go of attachments took on new relevance as he processed his losses. The Shinto reverence for nature and ancestors provided connection to something larger than himself. But both traditions also emphasized social harmony and proper conduct, values that his actions had violated. His religious beliefs had to be rebuilt to accommodate what he had done and who he had become. Gene sometimes visited temples and shrines, seeking solace or guidance from spiritual traditions. He made offerings and said prayers, going through rituals that connected him to his past and his culture. But he always did so with awareness that he was not entirely welcome in these sacred spaces, that his presence might be seen as pollution given his dishonorable actions. He was caught between worlds religiously as well as socially, believing but unable to fully participate in communities of believers. The concept of karma troubled Gene particularly. Buddhist teaching suggested that all actions had consequences, that causing suffering created spiritual debt that would need to be repaid. Gene had caused tremendous suffering, had killed hundreds of men, and inflicted pain on countless others. By karmic logic, he had accumulated enormous spiritual debt that would follow him through future lives. He wondered whether his motivations mattered in this cosmic accounting, whether saving lives balanced against taking them, or whether the universe kept simpler books that tallied only actions without regard to context. The ancestor worship that formed part of Shinto practice also created complications for Gene. He wanted to honor his father and maintain connection with his family line, but he had acted in ways his ancestors would have condemned. He was not sure whether his father's spirit would be proud or ashamed of what he had become. The rituals meant to connect him with his ancestors instead highlighted the distance between his choices and their values, making him feel alienated from his own lineage. Jin's relationship with the physical act of killing had changed fundamentally through the course of the war. His first kill had been traumatic, a moment that changed something essential inside him. By the end of the conflict, killing had become routine, a skill he could execute efficiently without conscious thought. This normalization of violence was itself disturbing, a sign of how thoroughly war had reshaped his psychology. He was not sure whether his current comfort with killing represented mastery or corruption, whether it was a necessary adaptation or a loss of humanity. The distinction between killing in combat and assassination continued to trouble Gene even after he had committed himself to both methods. Face-to-face combat felt honest in a way that stealth kills did not. When fighting openly, his opponents had a chance to defend themselves, could use their skills and make choices that might preserve their lives. Assassinating someone from behind denied them agency, reduced them from combatants to victims. Gene understood the tactical value of assassination and had done it countless times, but it never felt fully justified in a way that open combat did. The use of poison raised similar ethical questions. Poisoning an enemy's water supply or coating a blade with toxins felt like cheating, using tools that made victory too easy. There was no honor in defeating someone who had been weakened by substances they could not see or resist. Yet poison was effective precisely because it was dishonorable, because enemies did not expect it and had no defense against it. Gene had learned to use poison pragmatically, while still feeling that it diminished both him and his enemies, reducing warriors to people dying helplessly without the dignity of combat. The fear Gene had deliberately cultivated as a weapon also created moral complications. Making enemies afraid was effective, but required performing cruelty deliberately, creating suffering specifically to intimidate others. Gene had left bodies displayed in ways meant to terrify those who found them. He had allowed some enemies to escape specifically so they could spread stories about the ghost. These were calculated uses of psychological warfare, and they worked, but they also required thinking of people as objects to be manipulated rather than as human beings with their own experiences and fears. Gene wondered sometimes whether he had become the very thing he fought against. Khotan Khan had used terror as a weapon, making examples of those who resisted to discourage others. Gene had done exactly the same thing, just with different targets. The justification was that his terror served liberation while Khotan served conquest, but the methods were identical. If methods mattered as much as goals, then the distinction between them was less clear than Gene wanted to believe. He had become a mirror image of his enemy, using the same tools for opposite purposes. The question of whether ends justified means had no simple answer. Gene could point to concrete results, lives saved and freedom won through tactics that violated honor. But he could not know what would have happened if he had chosen differently. Perhaps another approach would have succeeded with less moral cost. Perhaps traditional methods would have eventually worked if given more time. Perhaps the Mongols would have withdrawn on their own for reasons unrelated to Jin's resistance. The counterfactuals were unknowable, and Gene was left with only the actual history, unable to compare to alternatives that never happened. The people Gene had saved rarely understood the price he had paid for their freedom. They saw only the results, the fact that they were alive and the Mongols were gone. They did not see the internal struggle or understand the moral complexity of his choices. Their gratitude was sincere, but also incomplete, based on partial understanding of what his actions had cost him. Gene appreciated their thanks, but also felt isolated by the recognition that they could never fully comprehend what he had sacrificed. The concept of sacrifice itself took on new dimensions for Gene. Traditional samurai sacrifice involved dying honorably for one's lord, accepting death to preserve honor and fulfill duty. Gene had made a different kind of sacrifice, giving up honor itself to preserve life. He had sacrificed his identity, his place in society, his relationship with his uncle, all to achieve practical results that required abandoning the values that had defined him. Whether this was more or less noble than traditional sacrifice was unclear, but it was certainly lonelier. Jin's understanding of courage evolved through his experiences. He had believed as a young samurai that courage meant facing enemies openly without fear. He learned that a different kind of courage was required to do what was necessary despite knowing it was dishonorable, to bear social condemnation and personal shame for the sake of practical good. It took courage to stand against authority, to trust his own judgment against unanimous tradition, to accept isolation rather than conform. These were not the forms of courage celebrated in samurai culture, but they were real and difficult nonetheless. The loneliness of moral conviction was something Gene had not anticipated when he began his journey. He had thought that doing the right thing would feel right, that justice would bring satisfaction. Instead, he found that moral choices often felt terrible, that doing what he believed was necessary brought pain rather than peace. He was alone in his convictions, unable to convince those who disagreed, and unwilling to conform to views he thought were wrong. This isolation was the price of following his conscience rather than tradition. Jin's legacy was uncertain, and would remain so for years or decades after the invasion. Different groups would claim him for their own purposes, interpret his actions to support their agendas. Reformers would cite him as proof that traditions needed updating. Conservatives would use him as an example of what happened when proper authority was rejected. Commoners will remember him as a champion, while samurai tried to minimize his importance. The real Jin Sakai would be lost beneath layers of interpretation, his actual experiences and beliefs less important than what people wanted him to represent. The question of whether Jin had been right or wrong could not be answered definitively because it depended on which values were used to judge him. By the standards of Bushido, he was clearly wrong, a traitor who had violated every important principle. By the standards of practical results, he was right, having achieved victory where traditional methods failed. By universal ethical standards that valued human life and well-being, the answer was ambiguous, as his methods had both saved lives and involved killing and deception. Right and wrong were not absolute categories, but depended on perspective and priorities. Jin himself never reached certainty about his choices. He continued to question, to wonder whether there had been a better path, to struggle with the knowledge that he had broken sacred codes, even if he had done so for good reasons. This ongoing uncertainty was perhaps the most honest response to genuinely difficult moral situations. Certainty would have been comforting but false, an oversimplification of complex realities that resisted easy judgment. Jin's doubt was a kind of intellectual honesty, an acknowledgement that he could not know with absolute confidence whether he had acted rightly. The community of people who had fought alongside Jin as the ghost represented something new in Japanese society, though its significance would take years to become clear. These were peasants, outcasts, and lower-class individuals who had proven themselves capable warriors without samurai training or noble birth. They had defended their homeland effectively, raising questions about whether the rigid class system actually served the purposes it claimed. The samurai insisted that only they could be true warriors, but the evidence of the resistance suggested otherwise. This challenge to social hierarchy was dangerous to those in power, which was one reason Lord Shimura had been so opposed to Jin's methods. Allowing common people to take up arms and make independent decisions threatened the fundamental structure of society. If anyone could be a warrior, then what made samurai special? If effectiveness mattered more than following proper forms, then why should people defer to authority that could not deliver results? These questions were revolutionary in their implications, potentially undermining the entire feudal system. The tension between social stability and individual capability was not easy to resolve. Society required structure and generally accepted rules to function. Complete individualism would create chaos, as everyone followed their own judgment without coordination. But rigid adherence to tradition could prevent necessary adaptation and innovation. Finding the right balance between order and flexibility was an ongoing challenge that every society faced. Jin's story illustrated the cost of both extremes, showing that neither pure tradition nor pure pragmatism was adequate to complex situations. The invasion had revealed vulnerabilities in Japanese military thinking and organization that needed to be addressed if future incursions were to be resisted successfully. The shogunate began implementing changes, though these reforms were gradual and often resisted by conservatives who did not want to admit that traditional methods were inadequate. The changes included studying foreign military tactics, developing new weapons and defenses, improving coordination between different regions, and creating contingency plans for scenarios that samurai culture had not prepared for. These military reforms were influenced by lessons from Tsushima, though Jin rarely received explicit credit. His tactics were analyzed and incorporated into training programs, but always framed in ways that maintained the appearance of adhering to traditional values. The modifications were presented as natural evolution rather than radical departure, allowing innovation while preserving the claim that Bushido remained supreme. This creative interpretation allowed necessary changes, while avoiding direct confrontation with cultural conservatives. The broader historical context of the Mongol invasions extended beyond Tsushima. The initial invasion in 1274 was followed by a larger invasion attempt in 1281, involving an even larger fleet and more soldiers. This second invasion was defeated primarily by a typhoon that destroyed much of the Mongol fleet, an event the Japanese called kamikaze or divine wind. The storms were interpreted as proof that Japan was protected by the gods, reinforcing religious and nationalist sentiments. The role of human resistance, including tactics pioneered by fighters like Jin, was downplayed in favor of emphasizing divine intervention. The historical memory of the invasion shaped Japanese culture for centuries afterward, influencing art, literature, military thinking, and national identity. The successful defense became a source of pride and a foundation myth for Japanese uniqueness and divine favor. The contributions of irregular fighters and dishonorable tactics were largely erased from official histories, which prefer to emphasize samurai courage and divine protection. This selective memory served political purposes but distorted the actual history of how the invasions were resisted. For Jin, the historical legacy was less important than the immediate reality of his continued existence. He had to find ways to survive day by day, to create meaning in a life that no longer followed expected patterns. He helped people when he could, intervened in situations where his skills made a difference, and tried to live according to principles that made sense to him even if they did not align with traditional codes. He was creating his own philosophy through lived experience, developing a personal ethics that integrated his samurai training with the lessons learned through necessity. The process of creating personal meaning after the collapse of inherited frameworks was difficult and ongoing. Jin could not simply reject everything he had been taught, as much of it remained valuable and true. But he also could not accept it uncritically, having learned through painful experience that some traditional teachings were inadequate or wrong. He had to evaluate each principle individually, deciding what to keep and what to discard based on his own judgment. This selective appropriation required constant thought and was never fully complete. Jin's relationship with nature deepened as he spent more time alone. He noticed details that had been invisible when he was younger and more focused on human concerns. He saw how different plants responded to seasons, how animals adapted to changes in their environment, how weather patterns shifted and cycled. Nature operated according to its own principles without regard to human rules or expectations. This perspective was liberating, a reminder that the categories humans created were not fundamental features of reality, but useful fictions that could be questioned and changed. The cycle of seasons continued regardless of human drama, and there was something comforting in this constancy. Spring arrived every year, bringing new growth. Summer provided warmth and abundance. Autumn brought harvest and preparation. Winter demanded endurance through cold and scarcity. These patterns repeated reliably, connecting Jin to rhythms that transcended individual lifespans and human conflicts. He found peace in recognizing that he was part of these larger cycles, that his problems were temporary within a context that continued regardless of their resolution. Jin's skills with sword and combat remained sharp through continued practice and occasional necessity. He still encountered bandits, corrupt officials, or other threats that required intervention. These situations allowed him to use his abilities in ways that felt straightforwardly moral, protecting the innocent without the ethical complications that had marked his fight against the Mongols. Simple problems with clear solutions were refreshing after years of ambiguity and difficult choices. But even these apparently straightforward situations sometimes revealed complications. Bandits were often desperate peasants driven to crime by poverty and lack of alternatives. Corrupt officials were products of systems that rewarded exploitation. Intervening to stop immediate harm was right, but it did not address the underlying conditions that created these problems. Jin found himself thinking about root causes and systemic issues, recognizing that individual heroism could only accomplish so much when social structures were fundamentally unjust. The question of how to create lasting change rather than just addressing symptoms became important to Jin as he matured. His fight against the Mongols had been reactive, responding to an immediate threat. But genuine improvement required proactive work to build better systems and institutions. This was not something a lone warrior could accomplish through combat skills. It required political organizing, economic development, education, and collective action over extended time. Gene was not well suited to this kind of work, which required skills and patience very different from those needed in battle. Gene occasionally considered whether he should try to influence policy and social development rather than just fighting immediate threats. He had knowledge and experience that could be valuable if he could find ways to share effectively, but his status as an outlaw limited his ability to participate in official processes. He could not simply walk into a government office and offer suggestions. Any influence he had would need to be indirect, working through others or demonstrating principles through example. The frustration of having insight, but limited means to implement it was considerable. The younger generation growing up after the invasion had no direct memory of life before the Mongols. For them, the stories were history rather than lived experience. They knew about Komoda Beach and the ghost only through tales told by parents and grandparents. Gene wondered how these stories would change as they were passed down, whether the complexity would be preserved or whether simplified versions would emerge that served current needs rather than historical accuracy. Memory was unreliable, and collective memory even more so. Gene encountered some of these young people during his travels, and their reactions to him varied. Those who knew he was sometimes viewed him with a mix of awe and confusion, unable to reconcile the legendary ghost of the tired man before them. Others saw only a wandering Ronin, and treated him with the casual contempt that masterless samurai often received. Gene preferred the latter treatment, as it required no performance or explanation. He could simply be himself without the burden of living up to expectations created by his legend. The aging process affected Gene as it did everyone, though his continued physical activity kept him stronger and more capable than most men his age. He felt aches and pains that had not existed when he was younger. Recovery from injuries took longer. His reflexes remained excellent, but were not quite as fast as they had been at his peak. These changes were natural and inevitable, reminders that even legendary warriors were subject to time and entropy. Gene found some humor in the contrast between his fearsome reputation and the reality of a man whose back hurt after sleeping on cold ground. The question of how his story would end preoccupied Gene occasionally. Would he die in battle, as samurai tradition suggested was proper? Would he simply grow old and die peacefully, an anticlimactic conclusion for a legendary figure? Would he be captured and executed for his crimes against samurai authority? Would he find some form of redemption or reconciliation? He did not know and could not control the answer. All he could do was continue living according to his principles and see what circumstances brought. Jin's thoughts often returned to his uncle Lord Shimura and the unresolved nature of their final confrontation. He wondered how his uncle was living with the outcome of their duel, whether Shimura felt relief that Gene had survived or only humiliation at having been defeated and spared. Gene still loved his uncle despite everything that had happened between them. That love had not died even when their relationship had broken. He wished things could have been different, but could not imagine how that would have been possible given who they each were. The impossibility of reconciling with Lord Shimura represented a deeper impossibility of fully resolving the contradictions in Jin's life. He had chosen a path that made certain relationships and certain forms of belonging unavailable to him. This was the price of his choices, and it was permanent. He could not undo what he had done or become who he had been before the invasion. The only direction available was forward, continuing to live with the consequences of decisions that could not be reversed. As you drift deeper toward sleep, let the story of Gene Sakai settle gently in your mind. His was a journey of transformation forced by impossible circumstances, a tale of how honor and survival came into conflict when enemies did not share the same values. Gene saved his home by sacrificing his place within it, becoming a legend while losing his identity, winning a war while questioning whether any victory was worth such personal cost. His story reminds us that moral questions rarely have simple answers, that difficult situations require difficult choices, and that those who make those choices carry burdens that others may never fully understand. The island of Tsushima continued in the cycles of life and seasons, beautiful and indifferent to the small dramas of its human inhabitants. The grass grew green in spring, golden in autumn. The ocean lapped at shores where battles had been fought and blood had soaked into sand. The mountains stood unchanging while generations of people lived and died in their shadows. And somewhere on that island, a lone warrior moved to the landscape, helping where he could, carrying memories and regrets, living a life that honored both the code he had been taught and the truths he had learned through breaking it. Rest now, and let the complexities of Jin's journey guide you toward peaceful sleep. May you find in the story some recognition of your own struggles with difficult choices, some comfort in the knowledge that others have faced impossible situations and found their way through, and some peace in accepting that doing our best is sometimes all we can do, even when that best falls short of our ideals. Good night, and may your dreams be gentle and your rest deep and restorative.